You're good.
Awesome. All right. Well, shall we go ahead and start then? Good. I know everybody here, so my second slide is going to be useless, but that's okay. So I was actually going to open up by telling a UDP joke, but I wasn't sure who would get it. Okay. Now I know. So we're going to talk a little bit about Docker for the .NET developer. So as I'm sure you guys are aware, Docker has typically been the purview of Linux, right? And since it was the purview of Linux, it didn't have any place in the .NET world until we ran into .NET Core. .NET Core brought all kinds of great things, and one of the great things it brought was the ability to run on Linux, which gave us the ability to run into Docker. Now, we also have Windows containers now, so we don't even need .NET Core to run in Docker. We can run ASPX sites in Docker containers now. Docker can run Windows Nano server and Windows Core server, and then run your Windows applications in there. Who's using Docker today? Aaron, Brian, a little bit. So I just want to give a quick disclaimer. I am not by any stretch an expert on Docker. I've just been playing around with it from a .NET perspective. And so I kind of wanted to share a little bit about what it is and how to use it, just to kind of bootstrap some interest, if possible. So hopefully I can answer any questions that you have. If not, Aaron and Dallin and Brian can do that. So you guys be ready, because you're my second line of defense, all right? So here's that second slide I promised you. So a little bit about me. My name is Troy Fillerup, for those who don't know me, and I like Jeeps. So, all right, before we move forward, I wanted to give a little technical tidbit. So I kind of like to find little things that help my productivity. This is completely unrelated to Docker. Does anybody know what that is? Come on, I made that graphic myself. What is it? Come on. What? Clipboard. A clipboard ring, right? A clipboard ring. Did you guys know that Visual Studio has a clipboard ring built into it? Let me show you what I mean real quick. Let me bring up Visual Studio. I should have had this up already. I apologize. So what happens a lot of times with me anyway is we're just going to create a new app, a new project here. I like to cut and paste a lot. My style of coding is find something from somebody else, cut it and paste it. That's kind of what I like to do. Everything's kind of componentized that way, right? So we're just going to do a console app, and we're not going to put it there because I don't have that plugged in. We'll just put it in here. Okay. Now, just so you know, all the other demos that I have are pre-recorded. I recorded them and screen captured them, so we won't have any of this waiting and all that kind of stuff, probably. So let's see what else. So let's say you have some comments in here. It would be probably best to do it like that. So let's say you want to copy like the line test2 down to here, right? What do? You do Control-C, Control-V, right? Control-C, Control-V. Now we want to take this line, we want to Control-C, Control-V that. But now let's say we want to put the test2, we want to paste it again. Well, we have to go back up and do Control-C. No, you don't have to do that. What you do is if you hit Control-Shift-V, it will cycle through the last things that you copied into the clipboard. And I have yet to find a limit as to how many things it will remember. So, what's that? 256. There you go. And I haven't tried it that far out. I'll try that when I get home tonight because I don't have anything else to do.
Control-Shift-V, you said?
Control-Shift-V. Now that's cool, right? Okay. Nothing to do with Docker, but I like to share things once in a while. All right, so let's get rid of this thing. Let's go to our next slide. So what are containers? Containers are essentially lightweight application hosts, right? What does that mean? Well, even today and in the past even more so, virtual machines was the big thing, right? You spin up a virtual machine and you put all your code in there, and then you can take that virtual machine, you can move it to another machine. You can have hot backups and all kinds of virtual machines are awesome, right? So you can do almost the same thing with a virtual machine that you can with Docker. So why do we use Docker? What's the difference? Well, Docker is much more lightweight, right? A Docker container essentially is nothing more than the files that you need to run your app, including any binaries, libraries, frameworks, things like that. And then it just runs on top of the host OS. So your Docker containers are much lighter weight than a virtual machine. Virtual machines can be big and bloated because you have to have the entire OS in there. And if it's Windows, that's even bigger, right? So containers allow you to have something very small and very lightweight to host your app. You still have the same benefits of you can take that Docker container and throw it on another machine, and you can still have the same advantages. Another thing that Docker allows you to do is it allows you to have scaling like the virtual machines doesn't really let you do very well. So Docker containers, if you're using what we call an orchestrator, such as Kubernetes or Docker Swarm, you can set up containers to have multiple instances of a container and then load balance between them so that all of your traffic is being load balanced between these containers. And if you decide, well, I need 5 more containers, my website is really busy because it's Christmas time, it's easy to spin those up using Kubernetes. We're not going to really go into orchestration today. It's a little bit out of scope for what I wanted to talk about, but this just kind of gives you a little overview on what containers are. Now, there are a lot of container platforms out there. There's like LXC, there's Rocket, there's one called LXD. There's a whole bunch of different ones, but the most popular one, at least I think, is Docker. And Docker is a container platform that can run on either Linux or Windows. And so that's why I like Docker, is because it runs on Windows. Now, this is an interesting point here. It solves the, but it works on my machine problem, right? How many times have we sent out an application, you get a call, it's broken? Well, it works for me. I don't know. Call the network guys. That's what we like to do at UTA. Call the network guys. They probably broke it. But Docker kind of takes that away, because when you build your app on your machine into a container, you take that container and put it somewhere else. It's the exact same runtime environment that you were using on your machine. And so it kind of gets rid of that excuse, so you can no longer just pawn your customers off on somebody else. All right, so let's do a quick demo and see how difficult it is to use Docker in .NET. So this is what I was talking to you about. I've got a recorded demo here. And so we are going to, now one thing about the recorded demos is when I record them, let me move this out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. When I record them, I tend to be more long-winded when I'm sitting in my basement. And so sometimes you'll see a pause where nothing's happening. And that's when I was thinking, oh, I got something really important to say, and I can't remember what it was when I'm standing up here. So if it just sits here for a minute, you'll know that's what's going on. So let me see if I can get this.
Is that because it takes so long while you're talking to yourself?
Exactly. Because I'm so interested in what I have to say that time gets away from me. You know, what can I say? All right, let's see if we can get this to play. I think it should be playing. Oh. Okay, so it says it's playing. I don't see any movement, though. Maybe this is what I was talking about. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be doing more than that, though. I apologize. It says it's moving, playing, but I don't see it. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to just bring up the video itself. I apologize about this. This worked really well in my last brown bag. Promise. It worked on my machine, so I don't know what's going on. All right. Okay. So we bring up Visual Studio, and this needs to be Visual Studio 2017. I think it'll work in 2015 too, but nobody should be using 2015 anymore. Everybody needs to step up, right? Okay, here we go. So I was saying something really important to myself, apparently. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new project. Now this is a really long video. It takes a long time. It's very complicated to create a Docker solution. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a .NET Core web application. And so the first thing that we need to do, and this will actually work with any of the .NET Core. We use .NET Core because it will run on Linux, right? So we're going to give it a name, and I think I called it something like Docker Demo or Docker Web Demo, something like that, if I remember correctly. So we create this. Now, it actually turns out that it's more work to not make it a Docker app than it is to make it a Docker app, because you'll see here, if you don't want to enable Docker support, you have to uncheck that. So it's actually a lot more work to not create a Docker app. So what you do is you leave that checked if you want to create a Docker, enable Docker support. And then you pick your framework. We're going to do 2.0 on this one. We're going to do a web application. And then, okay, so yeah, let's talk about that for just a second. So that is the OS that you want your Docker container to be running in, okay? So we can do Linux or Windows with .NET Core, right? If we're doing an old .NET Framework application, or not even old, I mean, .NET Framework isn't old, right? There's 4.7 is current. So if you're doing a .NET Framework application, you can do that in Docker. You just have to do it in Docker for Windows. You have to do a Windows container for Docker, okay? .NET Core, you can do it with a Linux container. And we'll talk a little bit more about those here in a minute. But okay, so then we hit OK, and we sit here and wait while it creates our project. And then you'll notice, after it stops not responding, that we now have a couple of things that you're not typically used to seeing in Visual Studio. We have a DockerCompose project, and we have a Docker file in our project, okay? The DockerCompose defines all the different Docker containers that you're going to be setting up in your application, because you can have multiple containers as part of an application. So you'll see here that it creates this DockerCompose file, and this is just Docker standard stuff. So this is just the way that Docker is. And it tells us the image that we're going to use, and then it tells us the Docker file for the container that we're going to create, and that is the Docker file. So it tells us what our base image is going to be. So Docker is a collection. You build Docker containers off of images, right? You have these images. If you go to Docker Hub, there's thousands of images up there, and there's a whole bunch of Microsoft-specific images. And we're going to grab the ASP.NET Core 2.0 Docker image to build our container from. No, it has everything you need to run .NET Core. So it has all the .NET Core libraries in the container. You don't, and that's the thing about Docker is you don't need the OS inside of the container. You only need what your application needs to have the OS there. Exactly. You can't even have it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Okay, so you can see, let's go ahead and pause this for a second. You can see that our website came up in the background, right? Now, when you build an ASP.NET application, typically, it's going to assign a random port to it, right? Everybody has seen that. There's always a random port, localhost : something. We have the same thing here, but, okay, you'll notice this is our PowerShell. We type in Docker PS, and that will show us all the containers that are currently running on our machine. So we hit play in Visual Studio. It started the Docker container and launched our website from inside the Docker container. Okay, so we are actually running this website inside a container from Visual Studio. It's actually pretty cool. So then we can go into our PowerShell and we can type Docker PS. That shows us all of our active containers that are running. We can see that we have the Docker web demo container running, and it is mapping port 32775 on the outside to port 80 on the inside of the container. So that's how we're able to get to it, is it's mapping that port into the inside of the container. Okay. So Docker PS is a good command to know so that you can make sure things are up and running and see how long they've been running and that kind of thing. And so this is when I was talking about the ports. See, sometimes I get ahead of myself in recordings, but in the long run, I make sure that the demos work, so I never have to say, oh, I don't know why this didn't work today. So trust me, all the demos work. Okay, and that's it. So you can see we fired up the demo or the Docker container all from within Visual Studio, and we didn't have to use a single command line. So if you don't want to ever use a command line, you don't have to use any command line to do Docker. Now you can do a lot with the command line, and so it's not a bad idea to do that, or to at least become familiar with the commands that you need. All right. Let's see. All right. So how do you get started using Docker in .NET? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to install Docker for Windows. So it is actually an application that needs to be running on your machine, and it's called Docker for Windows. And the website that you would go to for that is right here. Oh, it doesn't let me copy that. Let's go look at the website for that. Man, I am just really not as well prepared as I wanted to be today. I don't know what my problem is. Well, I know what some problem. Okay, let's go to the Docker for Windows website. Now, again, this installation is only if you are running on Windows. If you're running on Linux, there's a whole nother installation, but I don't use Linux, and so I'm not going to show you that. So this is the Docker for Windows website. You go in here, you download it from the Docker store, you install it. So the one that you get here is the Community Edition, so it's free. There's also an Enterprise Edition of Docker that is not free, but it comes with a lot of other stuff that you don't need if you're just learning to do it on your own. If you want to use VirtualBox instead of Hyper-V, then they have this Docker toolbox that you can download and use. I use Hyper-V just because it's installed by default in Windows, and it just makes it really easy. If you install this, there's really nothing else you have to do. If you do the Docker toolbox, you kind of have to do some other stuff, because Hyper-V and VirtualBox will not run together on the same machine. At least they didn't last time I tried it. Crashes the machine with blue screen, so don't try it at home. All right, so you got, let's say you got Docker installed on your computer, and you want to make sure that it's actually going to, that you got it installed correctly. So before we started this, I was talking to Jeremy, and it didn't quite start up right for him the first try. But here's some instructions on some things that you can do to test to see if you have Docker even running correctly. Now, you had a little, it was pretty easy for you when it came up and said Docker won't start. That's a good indication that something's wrong if it says it won't start. But if it doesn't say that, then you can go do this. And again, we're going to bring up a PowerShell instance. And we're going to, I must have closed down my PowerShell. Let's bring up PowerShell again. Oh, that's the ISE. You can't do this stuff in the ISE. I don't know if anybody never uses the PowerShell ISE. It's the integrated scripting environment, but you have to just use regular PowerShell. So we're going to open up PowerShell. We're going to go over to here, and we're going to type in some of these commands. So again, all of the stuff that you can do in Linux Docker, you can do in Windows Docker. You just do it through PowerShell. So here's the instructions. So we're going to say, first we want to find out what our version is. So we're going to do docker -- version. And we got 18.03. So that's a good indication that everything's working, right? The command was recognized, it returned a version number. And then we can do docker run hello world. Now hello world is a Docker image that they have up on Docker Hub for testing this kind of stuff. And by typing docker run hello world, it's going to go out there, get the image, download it, create the container, and launch the container, and then run the application inside the container. So that's a lot of stuff. That's pretty cool. So you can see here, hello from Docker. This message shows that your installation appears to be working correctly. And that is really good because this wasn't recorded, and so that could have gone really bad. So this just kind of gives you a quick and easy way to tell if you have things set up correctly. And if you don't, then we have this tool called Google that will help you figure out what the problem is. All right, so, and then once you get it installed, you'll notice that you have, and you can't see this from here, but down here in your task tray, you're going to have a picture, a little icon of a little whale with boxes on top. That's the Docker icon. If you go into that, you can go look at the settings for your Docker instance. And that's, or your Docker platform, and that's what this is here. So this will allow you to share drives. So right now I have my C drive shared with my containers so that my containers can access files that are on my C drive. And you need that because you need to be able to copy files back and forth from Visual Studio into your Docker containers. So you'll need to make sure to share that C drive with your containers. So we go to advanced, you can set up how much resources you want to dedicate to these containers and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff in here. If we go into here, this is stuff that I don't really understand, so I'm not going to talk about it. So you're asking yourself, well, why mention it? I don't know. All right, so let's look at, so we already created a nice little Visual Studio project that runs in Docker, right? We saw the website, you guys saw that it worked, and we're in good shape there. Now, what if we want to run multiple projects in multiple containers, right? I mean, the big buzzword now is microservices, right? Everybody wants microservices. We need a service that only does one tiny little thing, and you need 30,000 of these guys. So with Docker, it's really easy to do that. You just make more Docker containers, all doing their own little thing. Now, in Visual Studio, it's even super easier to make that all work together. So I kind of lied when I told you it was hard to set up Docker, and you saw that. So let's go ahead and what we're going to do is we're going to actually create another Docker container inside of our Visual Studio project. And so here we go. I'll just run the video file itself. So we come back up. This is where we ended last time. Is we have our Docker file. This is our original Docker web demo project. And what we're going to do is we're just going to add an API to the solution. Okay. So we just right-click on it. We do add new project. And same thing, right? ASP.NET Core Web Application. And then we're going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Docker Demo API. Yeah, see? And so we're going to fire that guy up. And again, it's harder to not make it Docker enabled than it is to Docker enabled. So we're going to pick API, and we're going to not uncheck the enable Docker support. So we talked a second ago about this. So you can drop this down and you can pick Linux or Windows. If you pick Windows, then it's going to launch in a Windows container. Now, the thing that you need to be cognizant of is that in your Docker settings, when you right-click on the menu down in your task tray, it's going to ask you, there's going to be an option there to change to Docker for Windows. You can only be running one at a time. It's either Linux or Windows. So if you switch to Docker for Windows containers, then I'll pause this for a second. Then you can't run Linux containers on your machine.
So when you say you can have multiple containers, but you cannot have a multiple operating system. You know, say this container is .NET, this container is Linux. You can't do that.
So it's the difference between Linux and Windows, right? You have to have the host running. You can only run either Linux or Windows, not both. So when you come down, and I know you can't see this very well unless you have super good eyesight. If you right-click on this little whale here, you have this option here, switch to Windows container. And so if you want to use Windows containers, that's what you would do. And again, the only reason that I could think of that you would want to use Windows containers is if you're doing .NET Framework applications that you want to put into a container, right? .NET Framework obviously doesn't run on Linux, but .NET Core does. So if you're doing .NET Core, there's really very little reason, because if you're doing Windows containers, they also have to run on a Windows host. So you can't run Windows containers on a Linux host, okay? You can run Linux containers on a Windows host, but not Linux. Okay? So if you're doing .NET Core, unless there's a compelling reason, I would recommend doing Linux containers.
Not matter when they're actually like, well, I guess you could have multiple hosts, right? That for some reason your project needed a Windows container, the rest were Linux containers.
You have to run them on different hosts, yeah, right? Yeah. So you have different base machines, but you could definitely do that. I mean, you could call between different containers. You just can't host them on the same machine. I think it has to do something with hypervisor. I honestly don't know. They didn't ask me for my input on that. They get what they get, I guess. Okay, so we have added our API. So now you notice we have our API project right here, and we have a Docker file in there. Now you look at our DockerCompose, and it added a new section to our DockerCompose. So it's going to put all of the different containers that we're going to need to run here in our DockerCompose file for us, and it's going to point to where the Docker file is that defines that container, which is going to be in our demo API, which is this one right here. We'll click on that, and you can see that it's built the same way as the other one was. It's just pointing to the Docker demo API, so it's creating another container that's set up the same way, just with different code.
Is there any limit to have a container? How many containers you can have?
Yes, and it depends on how much memory you have. You can host thousands of containers on a single host if you want to. There's really, I guess, realistically, there's no limit, but you know, it does. You can get a lot on there that's going to slow things down. I mean, it's like virtual machines. Technically, you could put all the virtual machines on the host that you want. It's just none of them are ever going to. I think you could probably put way more than you'll ever need. If your application needs more containers than your machine will support, it might be time to refactor your application. Okay, so now we have two containers defined in our DockerCompose, and then we're defining the container for the API here. And you'll see that it kind of goes through the steps that you would usually do for building and publishing your .NET application. It does a .NET build here, and it does a .NET publish here, and then it's going to copy from the publish folder to the app. So you can read that file. It's really easy to read. You can see exactly everything that it's going to do. And so what we're going to do, oh yeah, see then here the entry point. You know that when you run a .NET Core app, you use the .NET application, then run the DLL, right? So we're going to go ahead and run this again. We're going to fire up the Visual Studio run. And you can see down here everything that it's doing. And it's kind of interesting, I think, to watch that or go back and look at that later, because it kind of shows you what Docker is doing in the background. It's a really good educational process.
What's the benefit of it?
Okay, so let me get to that as soon as this video is over, and we'll talk about that. Absolutely. All right, so here's our website again. You can see that It's coming up. There we go. See that? So there's our website again. Now, let's go look at our PowerShell again, and we're going to do a Docker PS in our PowerShell again, I think. Okay, so this is all of the images that we have. So those are all of the images that I've installed on my machine. Now those aren't all running containers; those are just Docker images. So there's a whole bunch of them, and you can see down here, these are the two that we just created. So we have the Docker Demo API and the Docker Web Demo, and those are both containers that we just created. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go see which containers are currently running. So we're going to do a Docker PS, and these two containers are running. We have the Docker Web Demo that's running and the Docker Demo API that's running, and they were created 6 minutes ago. This is done. Now, here's our ports again. So this is the port for our Docker Web Demo. This is the port for our Docker API, and it's mapping that port to port 80. So if we go to there, and everybody knows the default Web API project creates a values controller, right? So if we go to that, you can see that we get the values returned that we would expect from our Web API. And again, this is calling into that container from Visual Studio. So you may be asking yourself, well, that's all great, but I need to debug my code. I don't really need to because I never really have bugs, but I've heard that some people step through their code, right, Dave? You know. I'm just kidding. So Dave's like, shut up, don't talk to me. So you can actually step into your Docker container from within Visual Studio. So we're going to go into here. These are Razor pages. I don't know if anybody's too familiar with those. This is an application with Razor pages. We're going to set a breakpoint on one of our Razor pages in the C# code. And what you'll see is that when we go back to our application, we go to this page, it will actually go into the container and break inside the container, and then we can step through and debug the code that is running inside the container. It's really, I don't know how these Visual Studio guys do it, because that is totally black magic as far as I'm concerned. So there you go. So it broke inside of our code, running inside a Docker container. Now, on that same note, I actually did remote debugging to Azure the other day. I was running in Visual Studio. My site was on Azure. I was debugging a site running in Azure. Totally off topic, but it was cool. All right, so we're going to come over here. We're going to change something in the HTML just to show you that it has the file watch working as well. We'll come back here and we'll refresh the page, and you can see that our change took effect in the HTML. So it's completely seamless to the way that you've always worked before in Visual Studio, and yet this is running in Docker. So again, this kind of gets rid of the excuse that it doesn't work on, or that it works on my machine. You don't have that excuse anymore if you use Docker. Okay. Now, Shanaz, what was your question again?
The benefit of the multiple.
Yeah, so the idea of a Docker container is to keep it as small and as fast as possible, right? So, like I said, the big buzzword these days is microservices, right? Everything needs to be microservices. And the good thing about that is that when you build a big monolithic service, you may only use a little teeny part of it most of the time, right? So you use these 5 methods 98% of the time, right? So what you want to do is, well, I need to scale that up. So you put a load balancer in and you scale your web API. Well, you're scaling all of that monolithic code just for these couple of methods that are used on. So what you do is you break up that web API, you break up that service into smaller services, and then you can say, okay, these services are hit really hard, let's scale those up. All these others are okay, we don't need to scale them, but we can scale these services up. So you say, let's put 10 containers load balanced running this service so that we get the throughput that we need without having to blow everything up. Does that make sense? So that's one reason to use Docker. Now you can do that same thing using Azure App Services, and we're going to look at App Services here in just a second. But with Docker, you can easily take those containers and put them onto another machine, or you can send them to somebody else. I mean, they're really portable in that way.
So is there any way that I can bring out to for the view, for example, production?
Yeah, so that's another thing that Docker containers are really good at is continuous deployment, right? So I don't know if anybody uses VSTS, but VSTS has some really powerful tools for doing a CI/CD pipeline. And with Docker containers, it's really easy to move them from one environment to another because you can make it so that you can inject environment variables into the container. For instance, so you don't want to have everything exactly the same between dev and prod, right? You have different connection strings, you have different whatever you're going to have. But you want the code to be exactly the same. You don't want to be changing code between dev and prod. So with containers, you can do environment variable injection. You can say, okay, when it's running in this environment, use these variables, this connection string. And when it's over here, exact same code, use this connection string. Any other questions? Alon, you had a question?
No.
You look like you have a question.
Okay.
All right.
He always looks that way.
Oh, that's right.
Puzzles, beyond the later.
All right, so let's go ahead and close this guy. Okay, let's see. So that was my multiple container demo, and that was that. And okay, so let's talk a little bit about Azure and how it deals with Docker. So Azure has really grown up a lot over the last couple of years. And they recently came out with some really strong Docker support. They now have the Azure Kubernetes service. And again, Kubernetes is a Docker orchestrator. And what that means is that it will handle all of your Docker containers and the load balancing and the scaling, the auto scaling and all that kind of stuff can be handled by Kubernetes. We're not going to talk about Kubernetes today, but we'll do some other brown bags where we do go into some Kubernetes and Docker Swarm stuff. But Azure was built and has a lot of really good tools for hosting Docker containers. And in fact, it's all really built into Visual Studio. Has anybody here used Azure much? A little bit? Good, okay. So that's one thing that I'm really starting to push is Azure knowledge. So I really recommend everybody becoming Azure experts. But one of the things that Azure has given us recently is the ability to do containers really easily. And Visual Studio integrates in with Azure really nicely. I mean, you can do everything you need in Visual Studio without ever looking at your Azure portal. It's really quite amazing. But we're going to look at some of the things that Azure does bring. So Azure has several different ways of running containers. They have a container service where you can host your containers. They have a container registry. So you can put all your images in this registry, and then you can grab them out and create containers from them. You have Service Fabric. Service Fabric is an Azure service that lets you host all kinds of things, and Docker is one of those. These two are, you can host single Docker containers, and we're actually going to delve into app services a little bit in a minute. And then there's others coming soon. For instance, they just released the Azure Kubernetes service. And the reason that I'm not talking much about that is because I frankly don't know that much about it yet, because it is fairly new. So there's all kinds of different ways to deploy into Azure. So let me see if I can get this running here. Is it doing anything? So this is an Azure portal. If you haven't seen Azure before, this is an Azure portal. And what I've done is I've created a resource group called SDG Docker. I got so much crap in my Azure account that I didn't want to dirty out the video with all of my other stuff. So I just created a resource group. A resource group is just a way that you can organize and categorize the resources that you're using in Azure. And I don't know why it won't run these videos. It worked last time, I promise. But it's not working, so that's okay. Luckily, I have the originals. So we're gonna watch this guy. So here's my Azure portal, and you can see there's nothing in there right now. I created this resource group, and it's completely empty. And we're gonna have Visual Studio create all of the stuff for us. And so let's fast forward since I already yacked about all this stuff. Okay, so you can see I have a BizSpark subscription. Yeah, if anybody's interested in Azure, let me know, because I've got some resources that we can look at for that. So we're going to go back into Visual Studio. Now, this is our same project that we were working on before. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually just publish this Docker web demo web application up to Azure. And it works exactly the same way that you're used to publishing now. So you'll just right click and do publish. And then it'll come up, and you know that there's lots of different targets that you can publish to typically. So these two are app services in Azure. You can publish directly to the container registry in Azure. You can publish to a virtual machine in Azure, or if you're still way back in the dark ages, you can publish to IIS or FTP or something silly like that. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to publish to a Linux app service, because Linux app services are the ones that host containers. So you'll see that when we pick that, we have two options: create new app service for containers. So I'm going to create a new app service for containers, and then it will publish into that. Now, when you do this for the first time, it takes quite a while to get all this stuff set up. But through the magic of editing, I've kind of chopped that down so it won't take nearly as long as it usually does. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to tell it what we're doing. So if you have multiple Azure subscriptions, you'll pick your subscription there. You will give your app a name. So I'm going to call that STG Docker Web Demo, all that other stuff. And it comes up with a default name, and this does need to be unique. I think it needs to be unique Azure-wide, which is weird, but I've never run into a problem, so maybe not. Then you pick your subscription. We'll pick a resource group. So I've already got a resource group set up, which is that STG Docker resource group. So I'll pick that one. That's where I want to put everything. We pick a hosting plan. So it's going to create a new hosting plan. This just kind of defines what kind of hardware you want to run this on. You can run it on a free tier. You can run it on a tier that costs $1,500 a month, and everything in between. So there's all kinds of different hosting plans that you can run things on. And then it's going to create a container registry for us. And again, Azure is going to do all of this for us, and it's going to tell us right here. This is kind of a summary of what it's going to do. It's going to create our hosting plan. It's going to set up our registry, and it's going to deploy and publish our app service. So once we've got that, we'll hit create. Okay, see, there's the summary. And then we'll hit create. And again, this is the part that takes a while. So what it's doing now is it's actually going up to Azure. It's creating all of these resources for us and spinning them up and getting them ready to go. So this step one, and it took like 4 or 5 minutes when I was recording this. Hopefully I cut it correctly. Yeah. Let's see if we can move this forward just a little bit. Okay, so now it's doing the actual publish. See, that's another great thing about recording. I could never fast forward like that in a live demo. That would be cool. Yeah, that would be awesome. So now you can see again here, it's running all of the stuff in our Docker file, and you can kind of see everything that it's doing, which is actually pretty cool. So we're publishing. Now, full disclosure, when I did this the first time, it did not work. It would not run in Azure. I couldn't figure out why. I had to make a little tweak, and I'll show you the tweak that I made. And I think it's because I've got the .NET Core 2.1 RC1 installed on here. I think that was causing a little bit of an issue. So now it's actually pushing all of our Docker stuff up to the Docker registry that it created. So here's the registry that it created for us in Azure. And so it's pushing all that stuff up there, and then it's going to create the container and then pop it down into our app service. Okay. So now it's done. So the publish succeeded, so it's done. What we can do now is we can go back into our Azure portal, and one of the things that Microsoft brought out with our .NET Core 2.1 is SignalR. Everybody know what SignalR is? Really cool, and they don't even use it. You go back to the Azure Portal, it's still empty. We have to go hit refresh. How lame is that, right? I thought that was stupid. But anyway, when we hit refresh, we can see that everything pops up. And those are the 3 resources that it created for us. So we've got our Docker Web Demo app service, our service plan. We have our registry, and then we have the SDG Docker Web Demo, which is running in an app service, and it is an app service for Docker containers. And so when we go into that, you can see, and I don't know if you've looked at Azure App Services before, you kind of have an idea of the things that are available in them. If we go into the Docker app service here, it's a little bit different than other app services, different options and different things like that. And if you go into the application settings blade here, then you can see that it's already set up all of the environment variables that we need to run our Docker container. So it's already got everything set up and working. So when we go to our website, this is, you can see it's running on Azure. So this is running on Azure in a container, and it's our .NET Core application. And you can see that it comes up. And again, the first time I did, let me show you really quick what I did to make that work. If I have that code, I think I might. Oh, no, I don't think I do. I have it on my external drive. So, yeah, I'll have to show you. What I had to do, I can just show you really quick, is if you remember that the Docker file that's in the project, so it sets up a couple of different sections. It has a section for building and the Docker image that it's going to use for build, and a Docker image that it's going to use for execution. Because typically when you run your Docker image for execution, you don't want to include the entire .NET SDK. The SDK is really only for building, and then when you run it, you want the fewest amount of files possible. For some reason, it wasn't working, so I actually had to change it to use the build image for my published application. So it includes everything, which made it work. It was missing a DLL, and I'm not sure why it didn't include that. But that's what I had to do. So if you run into that, that'll be a fix, but it's not a very good fix because then your container is way bigger than it needs to be. So I'm working on that. If I come up with a solution, then I'll let everybody know. How are we doing on time? Oh my gosh. I always do this. Let's see. Oh, actually, it turns out that's pretty much all I had. I do, however, wanted to show one other thing. So one cool thing that we have now is we have SQL Server that will run in Docker as well, right? SQL Server now is Linux compatible. It'll run on Linux, and you can run it in Docker. And so what I wanted to show you, we have just a couple of minutes. I want to show you how to do that. So let's say you need SQL Server in your application, but you don't want to install SQL Server on your box, right? I mean, that's possible. It's kind of big. You may not want to install the whole SQL Server on your box just for one project. So what you can do is you can actually install the SQL Server container on your computer and have a full-blown instance of SQL Server running inside a container on your computer that then you can just stop whenever you don't want to use it anymore. So you don't have to have SQL Server running all the time. So the way that we do that is we bring up our PowerShell again, and what we need to do is we need to pull the SQL Server image from Docker Hub. So we're going to do Docker pull. And we're going to need to make sure we pull the Linux version of the image.
How does that work with license?
So it's the developer version of SQL Server. So you couldn't use this particular one in a production app, but I mean, for development, it's totally free. So there's no worries about that. Now you could put SQL Server into a container and use it in production, but then there are some licensing issues to be worried about. So now we've got the image, and I actually pulled this before, so you can see that it's all already exists. It didn't really do anything. But then what we need to do is we need to run this guy here, which is a little bit more involved. Let's see if I can. You know, I was going to, but then I just blow everybody away and they go back to their work feeling bad about themselves. So I decided not to do that. And see, I can't even cut and paste it right. But I don't want to type it, and copying doesn't work very well because it's on multiple lines. But well, it should have worked. I don't know. I mean, I could type it, but just trust me when I tell you. So then what happens is it will spin up that container and it will run it, and then you can get to it with this SQL1 name, and you can do whatever you want in that SQL server. And then you shut it down, and when you bring it back up, all your stuff is still there, or you can go in and you can delete the image, and then it's gone off your machine forever. So it's kind of cool, and there's a lot more that you can do with Docker, but that's just kind of an overview of using it from the .NET perspective. So that's all I got. Thank you for your time. Are there any questions? We got 6 minutes. Or comments or smart remarks? Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a virtualization. Is there any issue of running a VM inside a Docker container? Or if you want to run Selenium that has virtualization, that can run on it.
So you can run Docker containers inside of Docker containers, but you can't run, as far as I know, unless somebody knows different, you can't run a full VM inside of a Docker container. Now, Selenium may be able to access code in a Docker container just like Visual Studio can, but I don't know how that would work exactly. That's a good question. But yeah, you can't run a VM. I mean, because that kind of defeats the purpose of a container if you're hosting a full-blown VM inside of a container. Containers are meant to be really lightweight, and VM would kind of blow that. Now, you can run containers in VMs, right? And like I said, you can run containers in containers if you wanted to do that. I'm sure there's a use case for that. Yeah, it'd be a good exercise anyway. Exactly. Let's see if you can like the infinity mirror. Let's see how many containers you can get stretched in there. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much.
One more question.
Yeah.
Any comments on the re-architecting into microservices, where is like Docker versus
So one thing. So you mean how small do you make your services and that kind of thing?
say refactoring one scale, just say, hey, I really want to scale this one service out. How do I break it out? What are that kind of size?
That's a tough call.
I'm gonna grow that.
You know, and that's the thing. I mean, that's a whole, and it's the answer that you usually give your customers when they ask if you can do something. It depends. Right?
How much time and money?
How much time and money do you have? I mean, and I think there is a point of diminishing returns. Yes, you could put a single method in every single service and have 5,000 services spread across your domain. I think that's going too far, right? Essentially, what you want to do is you want to bundle all the services that are directly related to each other and bundle them all into one application. And then, because you do want it to be small, one advantage that containers have is they spin up really quick. So if you do need to scale out a little bit, it spins up so fast that you don't notice any latency there, right? So you can spin up multiple containers really easily. And the bigger your service is, the longer it takes to get it up and going. But then again, the smaller it is, you're going to have a bunch of the, it depends, it's a case-by-case basis. And personally, I really like Azure App Services outside of containers because you can do a lot of the same things. If you're tied to Azure and you're not planning on moving them to other machines or other platforms, App Services give you almost all the same benefits as containers does. It's just that they're tied, obviously, into Azure. But anyway, I'm actually going to be doing another brown bag on Azure specifically, hopefully in the next couple of months, unless Jen won't let me do any more brown bags because I spend too much.
You're welcome.
So anyway, but yeah, thank you. All the UTA, or not UTA, not you guys, the SCG guys, I sent out an email. I had a couple responses, one from